Nowadays is one of the most essential items in the world. Like if you walk in the kitchen and it's not there, there's going to be a huge problem. In this video, we want to talk about an invention that even in the ancient times it was important, especially in hot places. This is the history of refrigerators. Where was the first refrigerators invented? When you look at Wikipedia or different sources, it always states that the first refrigerators were made in the deserts of modern-day Iran, deserts called Dasht Lut and Dasht Akavir, and the date is about 400 BC. When you look at these refrigerators, also known as yakhchal, they look very simple from the outside, but when you go inside, you realize that it's a work of art and engineering. People in the ancient times had realized that ice is extremely important to keep their food and beverages cold. Of course, in the winter, they had plenty of ice available to them, but once that ice melted away because of the hot season coming, they didn't have access to it for many months. And that's why ancient engineers, especially in Iran, started thinking of ways to keep this ice throughout the whole year. Historians have written that at least 2,400 years ago, these engineers figured out a way to keep this ice cold for a very long time, even through the very hot summer. You really can't underestimate ancient designers and engineers, because what they've built is truly insane. If you've seen our video about the oldest air conditioners, it was the same people in the same area of the world that kept their house and environment cool in the extremely hot desert months. The yakhchals, or these ancient refrigerators, were made with the ancient Persian concrete called saruj, which is not as strong as concrete, but not only does it keep the building together, it's also a great insulation. Also, the walls of these refrigerators were 2 meters thick, and that means they didn't allow any heat to come inside, and also keep the interior extremely cold just like a freezer. When you look at these yakhchal, it looks like a dome from the outside. But once you step inside, you realize how it kind of works and how impressive these ancient designers were. When you walk inside, you're confronted with a huge pit of ice, and that's exactly what yakhchal means. It means a pit of ice. And countries that speak Farsi or Persian call modern refrigerators yakhchal, which is an ancient word that was never changed. But let's see how these yakhchals worked. You first have to know that these refrigerators were made next to rivers or these ancient water streams called the kanat. And most of the time, since it was in the desert, there was no available rivers, and they were built next to these reservoirs. In the winter, when the weather started to get cold, they allowed the cold water to enter the pit of this ice house. But how much? Only a few centimeters, so they didn't want it to get too deep. And overnight, when it gets below freezing, the water at the bottom of this ice pit would freeze over, creating a sheet of ice. And because of the awesome design, even when the sun was out in the day, the ice wouldn't melt. And the next night, the same process would occur. They would allow a little bit of water on top of this ice sheet, let it freeze over the freezing night, and continue that process until the ice pit is full of ice. So in a way, when you get to the hot summer months, you have a pit that's completely filled with ice, and people can buy it and use it. Even if you're in the desert in the hot scorching sun, the ice is not gonna melt just because of how this building was designed. Another insane idea that these engineers and designers came up with is that the ice sheet keeps the other ice cooler. Basically, the ice on top is kept cool because of the ice underneath. The middle is kept cool by both sides, and vice versa, and they basically keep each other strong. You can test this theory almost anywhere, even cities where it snows. As you know, when the snows started to melt in the summer months, the last places that melt is the hills of snow that the snow plowers took. Like for example, in this video, you see a mountain of snow that was compiled throughout the winter, and it takes until the middle of the summer till it's completely melted. And that just shows us even snow keeps other snow cold in very hot temperatures. So we say winter is over and this pit is filled with ice. What do? They use this in the hot summer months. Of course, it's a form of business, so they would sell it to locals so they can use it to keep their drinks and food cold so it doesn't get spoiled. These refrigerators were designed in a way where all the locals could purchase from it and it wouldn't run out through the summer. If they needed more, they would build more yakhchals. So only the desert areas had these type of refrigerators? No. Many other places, including colder cities in the winter, had it as well. The technology for these guys was much different and it was a little bit easier. Usually next to mountainous regions, there's a whole lot of ice throughout the winter. So these guys would go next to these mountains, carve out the ice pieces, and create a ditch where they can store it. They would specifically dig the hole in a shady part of the mountain, so in the summertime, it's not in the hot scorching sun. And just like the other method, the ice layers would keep each other cool even when the temperatures were hot. It's interesting to note that the invention of ice cream was also done by ancient Persians, because they were the first ones that had access to ice like this. The first ice cream is this, called the falude, which you can still enjoy it to this day. Imagine you're walking in the hot scorching sun in the desert and someone hands you this ice cream. Imagine the feeling you had this for the first time. It might be hard to believe, but some of these desert areas in Iran use these yakhchal until the year 1960. And that's because it was a business and there were buyers for it at that time. But with the introduction of electricity, even in the rural areas of these deserts, these yakhchals died out, and they died quick because now they could just use normal refrigerator in their home. And in a way, a 2,500-year-old tradition finally dies out. But don't go anywhere, because this video was the history of refrigerators, not just the ancient ones. So what about the modern refrigerator? When was it invented? And where did this idea come from? You have to know that in the beginning of the 19th century, Europeans and Americans were always looking for a way to keep their food cold and also to keep their house cold, aka AC systems. In the year 1834, a Scottish scientist by the name of William Cullen invented a machine that worked with a chemical compound called the diethyl ether. And with this machine, it could keep a small compartment cold. Basically one of the first refrigerators. But this machine was extremely expensive, complicated, and it didn't work properly, so it was never successful. But it created a spark in the scientific community that something like this is very much possible. So scientists, chemists, and other engineers started to go at it to make their own refrigerators. If you've seen our video about the man that changed the world and disappeared, basically Rudolf Diesel, you're familiar with Diesel himself. And you also realize that he had a very good friend from a young age called Carl von Linde. Linde was also a genius, and he had his own inventions. And he was the first inventor of the compressor refrigerator that worked with ammonia. Even though Linde created an amazing invention, it still wasn't able to be produced because it was extremely expensive to run a production with this. But after this, the more we move forward, this invention gets simpler, better, and also cheaper where a person can buy it. And when we eventually get to the year 1913, the Americans take Linde's idea and create the very first affordable refrigerators, where a normal person in the US could finally buy it. Only 11 years later, in the year 1924, the very famous company Frigidaire takes the ammonia out the refrigerator and creates their own cooling gas, Freon, which was much more efficient. But at this time, not everyone could use these refrigerators since it required electricity, which is why the Australians come along and they invent the kerosene-powered refrigerators. Kerosene works the same way as these, where it has a compressor and moves gas, but the kerosene is the power instead of electricity. And anywhere where you couldn't find electricity, people will buy these kerosene-powered ones. But after the 1960s, most places in the world got electricity, and the kerosene refrigerators died out quickly. Modern refrigerators still use other forms of Freon, so it's not that much different from the Frigidaire one invented in 1924.